Excuse me, sir. Do you mind if I could
Yeah,
get some Doom?
I can get you
from
some Doom.
Yeah,
sure.
I'd love some Doom. Oh gosh!
Doom, 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 doom.
If you want to get a different outcome, you must change the process.
Oh, that guy right there? That's Mick Gordon. He's a sound designer and a composer for video games, and he's also a complete maniac. He created the music behind games like Killer Instinct, Wolfenstein: The New Order, and most importantly for this video, 2016's Doom, a reboot of the science fiction first-person shooter from 1993 and a wild, wild game. The Doom soundtrack is heavy, distorted, and it fits perfectly in Doom's atmosphere using some very cool production tricks that I think would inspire any musician. In this video, I'm going to be referencing a talk that Mick gave in 2017 for GDC about his process creating the Doom soundtrack and why this creative process is so essential to the universe that Doom inhabits. And I'll also touch on some other things that Mick did to this soundtrack that made it stand out so much to me. The hour-long video is very entertaining and informative, so I'd still recommend checking it out, but my goal in this video is to condense that talk and give it some good visuals to help people with less musical production knowledge understand Mick's inspiring process. So when Mick was given the brief to create the Doom soundtrack, it said 3 simple things. 1, no guitars. 2, I love synths. 3, we want you to make music that no one has heard before. It needs to fit the game perfectly and instantly loved by fans. Mick explains that if you gave this brief to any musician, they could easily come up with a soundtrack that is inspired by the brief, but not a single one of them could execute it. The reason that they fail to execute it is because they're going through the same exact process that they go through every time to create music. And you just can't expect someone to come up with music that no one has heard before without changing the process. Mick's motto is change the process, change the outcome. So why don't we talk about how Mick Gordon did that? Inspired by the Doom sound design team, he went back to his studio and got to work. Now Doom is this fast-paced first-person shooter that just never stops moving. I love it because it knows exactly what it is and it delivers it perfectly. There's a whole lot of demons invading Mars and you have to send them back to hell. So Mick thought he should start there. He wanted to start low and gritty just like hell, so he started with a super low sub-bass loop. The problem is the human ear can only hear frequencies from 20 to 20,000 hertz, and we hear sounds best from 1,000 to 5,000 hertz. And with that sub-bass at 36.7 hertz, it barely fits in that threshold, and it's one of the hardest frequencies for humans to hear. As shown on this graph, it takes a lot more volume to hear that sub-bass the same way you'd hear someone's speaking voice. Even more so, these sounds had to be heard on the televisions of every person playing the game, so a sub-bass of this tone is really hard to pull off. So how does Mick solve this issue? The answer is ring modulation using white noise. Now let me explain what that is. Mick would have to create a white noise signal at 36.7 hertz, which is the same as turning a white noise signal on and off 36.7 times a second. That's what hertz means when you're talking about frequencies, how many cycles a second something is moving. So by layering that signal over the bass, this is what you would get.
Now, if you take this combination and you feed it through a distortion processor, you get all sorts of really interesting harmonics. In the next video here, I'll run these two together through some distortion. You'll hear all sorts of interesting stuff start to happen. Now, I'll turn the white noise off halfway through, and you can hear what the distortion is doing to the sub alone. And you'll notice that the white noise is actually doing quite a lot.
You can see how much grittier that white noise makes the bass, and Mick loved it. He sent the sound off to Chris Hite, the audio director for Doom, and awaited his response.
He replied with this.
But right after that, he said, "I feel you've taken the first step on a journey towards the perfect destination. Keep going, you're almost there." And with Mick Gordon realizing that the issue wasn't with going too far, but not going far enough, he reconvened and started again. He wanted a new outcome this time, so to change the outcome, he changed the process. He was reminded of a really interesting technique that audio engineer Tony Visconti came up with while recording David Bowie's album Heroes in Berlin. Long story short, Visconti came up with a dynamic system that allowed reverb to change depending on how loud Bowie's voice was by setting up gated microphones to record sound at certain volumes. It was an output that constantly changed depending on the input. Mick was inspired by this and set out to create a new process for the soundtrack, to design a system that dynamically produced interesting and appropriate musical bits based on the input. And that input would be a simple sine wave. Mick chose this because it's the purest representation of what sound can be. That sine wave would split into 4 different paths running through a ton of analog equipment to distort and transform the signal, and it was mixed down into his recording software. He put a very small amount of feedback back into the input using a microphone, so whenever the output of the system would get quieter, the feedback would get louder and bring up those interesting musical bits he was looking for.
I have a little example of that running here. So we can hear whenever that distortion sort of stuff starts to die out, the feedback comes in, right? I'm going to show you my first experiment running through this array. I'm going to show you a series of sub-sine wave tones. They're 4 F notes, followed by a little bit of a gap. It's not meant to be buzzing, that's that buzzing over there. That's it. Now, I know what you're thinking. It's really not amazing, right? I know, music of the year right here. Woo! But when you run that through this array, all sorts of interesting stuff starts to happen. What I want you to listen out for is a couple of things. At the end of those 4 F notes, you'll hear another note creep in underneath. It's like an E. It's like just below the F. That's not being generated from me. That's not being generated from the computer. That's coming from some ground hum within the array. Additional to that, there's all sorts of interesting distortion layers that are coming in and out based on that splitter on the left-hand side there that was sending a signal to those compressors along the bottom. Sometimes, if I wanted to, that was essentially side-chaining the signal from those other chains. Based on whatever the input was doing, it could dynamically change the mix of whatever each chain I had. The last thing I want you to hear out for is all sorts of interesting stuff that's going on with the sonics and things. You'll hear all sorts of harmonics. Anyway, here again is that same subwoofer tone run through this array several times.
This array of equipment was Mick's instrument for creating the Doom soundtrack. He fed the system a very simple input, and all he would change was how loud the sound is and the note he's playing.
Here's another example. This is the same sort of thing. So it's da-da-dun, 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 da-da-dun. Pretty basic, right? Now, I'm going to play that one through this array again. This is some interesting music that is appropriate to Doom. It starts feeling good. When we started putting it into the game, it started working really, really quite well. But we only reached this thing because I changed the process. Changed the process, and we changed the outcome.
Mick changed the process of creating music, and as a result, he changed the outcome. But something was just missing. He felt like they were getting that much closer to the finish line, but they were missing one thing: the guitars. But he didn't want to just throw some metal sounds in there and call it a day, because that's the exact reason why the brief said no guitars in the first place. His team wanted to find a new process for creating interesting guitar tones, so that's exactly what they did. He remembered another audio engineer named Sean Bevan who worked on a record with Marilyn Manson. He had this interesting technique where they would play the normal guitar riff up an octave and twice as fast. Then they would take that recording and run it through a tape machine at half speed and would get a really gritty and chunky tone from it. Mick decided to try that with a guitar riff he used in Doom.
So this is the guitar part played up an octave twice as fast. Now I know it sounds like Bill and Ted at the moment, don't worry. We record that to tape at 30 inches per second, play it back at 15 inches per second, run it through a preamp, which is kind of jacked pretty hard, you get this. Pretty cool stuff. Super, super gnarly, right?
And that's when Mick learned his next lesson: change the brief if it makes the project better. He still fulfilled the concept of making music no one has heard before, but he had to break some rules to get there. Mick also had this riff that he played on this crazy 9-string guitar, but it sounded way too much like a guitar to him. He had this plugin by Synaptic called Morph, where you can create hybrid sounds by morphing 2 different recordings, so Mick attempted to mix his original guitar recording with the sound effect of the chainsaw from the original Doom, and this is what he ended up with. One day Mick was working on a bass part and he was just a little bit bored.
3 notes, repeats. Pretty basic stuff, kind of bored with it.
He was playing around with this synth he uses called Harmor, where you can input an image into the synth and use it to modify the sounds you're recording. So Mick took a photo of the number 6 and decided to plug that into the image synthesizer a few times just to see what would happen. Obviously you can see that there's a big space in between 2 of those 6s, so he just decided to throw a little part in between.
What's the worst that can happen, right? I mean, for anybody to see that, they'd have to crack open the game, pull out the WISE files, and run every single file through a spectrograph and find that single bass part. It's never going to happen, right?
So it doesn't get any clearer than that with all the pentagrams and the 666 right there. They're letting you know, here's our allegiance to Satan, and your children are listening to this.
But in another song he did, he hid the message in the center of his song and flipped both phases on each side so that if you put the song in mono, it would sound like this. If you reverse that clip, then this is what you would hear.
Now, do you know how many news websites wrote about that one? Friggin' none!
Mick actually did this again in the theme song of the 2020 game Doom Eternal, where if you played this song back in mono, you would hear the melody of the endgame song from the original Doom. And Mick also took part in a lot of the tonal elements that the sound design team worked on for the game. This means that if there's any sounds in the game that can have a certain musical tone to them, they need to be in the same or similar key as the music playing in the background, so the sounds don't clash and sound dissonant or uncomfortable to listen to. These kinds of details are the types of things that make the sound in a game not just good, but great. Sounds that aren't just picked up on by the average player because they blend so well into the gameplay. In some of Doom's levels, you're fighting with a chain gun. The chain gun can expand into 3 separate guns that, when fired, produce a tone. In Doom, that tone is actually the same as the root note of the song that's playing in the background, so it blends in. Here's what that sounds like. Mick Gordon has included several Easter eggs and production tricks that make this soundtrack so great, and Doom fans just continue to find more and more. There are plenty of melodies from the original Doom game that snuck their way into the new soundtrack as a tribute to the original soundtrack. And many of the songs are programmed to play in a different arrangement depending on gameplay, which makes every playthrough different than the one before it. You may hear the same song every time you play a level, but the order in which you hear it will change depending on the way you play. For example, a song will play one of maybe 50 variations of the same verse on loop, and then once you get a big kill or do something really impressive, the music will transition into the chorus right away and make you feel like you're arriving at the climax of the level in a seamless and very smart way. This is almost exactly what I talked about just a few weeks ago in my Untitled Goose Game video, and I think Doom is doing some very necessary things to move music forward in gaming, not just as a background piece, but as one of the main elements. When recreating a game 23 years after its original release, Doom could have done something simple yet derivative of the original game, just performing covers of the original soundtrack. But with hiring Mick Gordon and giving him the task of creating music that no one has heard before, they made something entirely new using the fresh concept of player input affecting the output of player gameplay. And also, it just sounds so good. Thank you for watching my video, and please subscribe if you haven't already. I post a new video every single Monday. And this week I'm giving away a free high five to everybody who comments on my video, so take advantage of that deal. And this week's Gamer of the Week is not Woodrow Wilson. You're canceled, buddy.
It's Doom!